Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to another FSR Insights. My name is Lucila, and together with Leonardo Mays, our FSR director, we host once a month the FSR Insights, which is part of the FSR online series specifically dedicated to discuss the work of top academics in the field of energy and climate regulation. So for today, our FSR Insights is about an academic work that we are very glad to host. And you do so because we perceive it as a perfect suit for the series. The work is provoking. It has a provoking title. Does Europe need a hydrogen network? And it brings to the center of the debate a meticulous economic assessment of the trade-off between electricity grid expansion and hydrogen network, as well as between the fuel imports and domestic production. So critical thinking is certainly what is needed in times when the electricity market design has been under scrutiny, and the incentives, the deployment of new energy vectors such as hydrogen or e-fuels are being raised as priority in the government policy agenda. So to introduce this topic, we have today a keynote speaker, Tom Brown, professor of digital transformation in the energy systems at TU Berlin. Tom will start by making a presentation within 20 minutes, followed then by the sequence of questions addressed by our two discussants of today. Our first discussant is Christine Brandstätt, assistant professor at Copenhagen Business School, and our colleague Tim Schittekatte, or FSR part-time assistant professor and postdoctoral fellow at MIT. So as usual, Leonardo will be acting here as multiple roles, as he knows how to do very well, as a discussant and co-host, asking questions when it's appropriate, or collecting the most interesting questions coming from the audience, which we expect to receive many. And for the audience, don't hesitate to address the questions in the box below during the discussion. And finally, with no further ado, Tom, the floor is yours for the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I hope you can see my screen. I'm going to present some work and some preliminary work together with members of my group, Fabian Neumann and Lisa Zehan, and Marta Victoria from Aarhus and Johannes Hamp from Gießen. So without further ado, I'm going to give you first of all a bit of a motivation into the question of hydrogen networks. I'll present you the model that we intend to use to answer the questions, show you some of the results, and then give a bit of an advert at the end for openness and transparency in the modeling side. So there's a bit of motivation. All of the scenarios that we see for 2050 from across different think tanks and organizations show a very large increase in electricity demand in 2050 that you see in the top graph, where we see today at just over 3,000 terawatt hours, with doubling to tripling of electricity demand. And how that's met in the different scenarios for 2050 for Europe, we see it's mostly wind and solar being light blue in this graphic. So that presents a particular challenge, of course, in terms of variability, but it also presents a challenge in terms of the infrastructure required to integrate that much wind and solar. And a lot of this modeling is done in very, very rough models where we don't see details in the grid or the variability, and that presents a problem, particularly because actually, if we look at the infrastructure and how it's going right now, we see a lot of problems building grid on the one hand, and also some of the infrastructure for generation on the other hand. So we've seen a lot of protests against new onshore wind parks in countries across Europe, not just in Germany and the UK, but also in Belgium, Netherlands, you name it. This is a particular problem if you think of regions that don't have access to good solar resources or access to offshore wind. I think of these inland regions like southern Germany, how are we actually going to supply these regions during the winter time when we're far away from offshore wind, for example? So one suggestion that has been floated to address this challenge is that we produce electrolytic hydrogen, for example, at the coastlines of Europe, where we have lots of offshore wind, or abroad in, for example, North Africa or Saudi Arabia or Australia, and we transport that hydrogen to these different sites around Europe with a pipeline network. That enables us to bring that energy to those regions like southern Germany that don't have other good resources. So it would solve this transport problem that we can't build the power grid, and it would solve this deficit that we can't get enough onshore wind built in the system and we can't bring it to the right places. So that's at least one motivation for a hydrogen network. And we see that the gas transmission system operators are suggesting a backbone network that covers the whole of Europe, just like the natural gas grid and the power grid does today. But do we actually really need this? And they're suggesting it not just for power generation, of course, but also for industry demands for hydrogen and for transport. So I've tried to actually think a little bit about what actually is really necessary. So if you go through the different sectors where we see a need for a hydrogen network, typically motivated by the fact that there's a hydrogen demand there that can't be met by local low-cost hydrogen, then there are actually alternatives there for these various sectors. So if we look at backup power and district heating, which are needed particularly in the winter when the wind and solar isn't available, we can use other derivative fuels that are based on hydrogen, like e-methane or a-methanol. Where we need very high temperatures in industry, we can electrify those sectors or also use derivative fuels. Heavy duty land transport, so trucking, for example, could use battery electric vehicles. If we move to the industry sector, we hear a lot of talk about hydrogen for reducing iron ore to make steel and for ammonia production, but the locational needs for the hydrogen network there aren't really necessary if we're able to move those industrial production sites to the coastlines into industrial clusters or abroad, also taking that direct reduction to those locations where we already have a lot of iron ore and high hydrogen availability. And if we go into those other sectors that need hydrogen or derivative fuels from hydrogen, like shipping, aviation, and high-value chemicals, where we're making ethylene, for example, for plastic production, again, it's the derivative fuels we need, not the hydrogen. And those, of course, are much easier to transport and can be manufactured. Provocative question in the title, do we need a hydrogen network? Well, actually, strictly no. If we look at all those hydrogen demands, there are alternatives there. But of course, it could be easier to do it with a hydrogen network in Europe and lower cost as well. So there are actually trade-offs here when we talk about the hydrogen network. We don't necessarily need it, but it may be advantageous. Okay, so that's the sort of setup. For the modeling side, there are several challenges when we talk about infrastructure planning. The first is that we have a lot of grid bottlenecks in the system today, especially in the power grid, and it's not good enough to just model one node per country, which is what we often see in these studies. We need more detailed modeling to see those infrastructure trade-offs. Second part is we actually need a holistic planning. We need a co-optimization of generation, transmission, and storage, because optimizing everything separately just doesn't work. The more transmission we have, the more favorable that is to the wind, the more storage, the more favorable to solar. We can't look at these things in isolation. We can't look at the gas network in isolation from the power network. We need to do it in a holistic way. And we don't see that in much of the modeling today. If you look at the TYNDP process, we see a market scenario model that's separated from the grid model, and we don't have the coupling that we need, especially given that the grid bottlenecks are there and need flexibility to manage them. So this pushes us in the direction of very, very large models, big data, and very complex models, and I'm going to present to you one of them today. So this is our open source model, PIPESA Europe SEC. PIPESA for the framework we use, Europe, SEC for sector coupled, and it's based on a framework that we actually built to answer this kind of question called Python for Power System Analysis. So it's for these high resolution studies, filling that gap between energy system simulation software like Plexos and Times and the power flow software that we need to understand the grid physics. And the reason why we need that is because most of the scenarios for decarbonization see high levels of electrification and high levels of renewable integration where we need to manage that flexibility. This is downloadable from GitHub, and it's now used worldwide by large numbers of researchers, consultants, including TSOs in Europe and various NGOs as well. So that's the framework. The model implementation we use is called PIPESA Europe SEC, and you can see the various scenarios that we have in the model on the left-hand side. So we have a sort of map of the energy as it flows through the model with the primary sources on the left, our various grids and storage intermediaries for taking that energy to the demand centers on the right-hand side. So we're modeling the electricity grid, which you can see on the right-hand side. We also model a new hydrogen grid that can either use new pipelines or retrofit old methane pipelines. We have the original natural gas network there as well, and also carbon dioxide networks and liquid hydrocarbons. So this bottom corner of the graph becomes increasingly important when we look at these net zero scenarios, because we have to look carefully at the carbon dioxide management. If we want, for example, liquid hydrocarbons for our dense fuels or for our chemicals industry, then we need to carefully map the carbon dioxide through the system, for example, capturing at point sources in industry or electricity or from the air directly, and then managing that through the process and maybe also sequestering it at the end. On the demand side, we have our regular electrical devices, our various devices for meeting water and space heating need in buildings, so heat pumps, gas boilers, district heating networks. Transport side, we have the land transport, aviation and shipping, and then the various denominations of industry sector, which could be using a variety of different fuels and processes for their needs. And we need to do this at high spatial resolution that you can see on the right-hand graph with the electricity grid. So it's a quite complex model. It's sector coupled. It's looking over many hours of time as well, and a lot of spatial detail. It requires a lot of data, of course, and we have a whole special workflow plan designed to take all this data into the model and then process it through the results. So we have to, for example, apply data reduction techniques to reduce the grid. Typically, we like to work with 200 to 300 nodes because that gives you enough resolution to see those important grid bottlenecks in countries like Germany or the UK. We have our various power plants, our time series, and our potentials for the expansion of wind and solar. On the industry side, this becomes important for hydrogen. Then we have a high resolution data set of where the industry is, because that's very relevant for the hydrogen grid. You see here, for example, the iron and steel industry, where it currently is located in red. You see big centers in West Germany and in Netherlands and Belgium and the UK. We have the chemicals industry as well in orange, and then you see much more spatially distributed the cement plants in blue. So that data is going into the model for the industry, and the industry has various different fuel and process switching options for decarbonization. So the modeling choices, we have to set some things exogenously, so we make some assumptions about where certain demands are, what their time profiles are like, how much retrofitting we have in the building sector, for example, what kind of energy carriers we're using in the transport sector or in the shipping, so shipping, aviation and land transport, and how steel, for example, transforms. We have various electrification and recycling options for the industry, and then what the model itself will optimize is the capacities and operation of the system. And those capacities include the generation, the various transport networks for electricity, gas, hydrogen, and carbon, our technologies for heating in the building sector, and all the various conversions of power to gas, power to liquid, power to heat, and so on. So we can also endogenize the supply of process heat and the various carbon capture options. So where do we capture carbon? Is it from industry? Is it from power sector, or directly from the air? So I'll show you a couple of results and discuss those a little bit and then wrap up. So we'll show you results for overnight scenarios where we look what would be necessary to really reach a net zero system. We can also do the pathway analysis, and I can show some results from that at the end if anyone's interested. And we look at all the sectors coupled together. We'll assume for these first couple of results that we have energy autarky, so that Europe has to be self-sufficient in its various energy supplies. We have to assume changes to the market structure. So we have market zones right down to the level of these individual nodes in the models. That's 181 bidding zones. We have conservative technology assumptions. So we take costs and efficiencies for 2030 from the Danish Energy Agency. And then once we have this in the model, we can examine various different features of the model. So we can look at restricting power generation, power grid expansion, for example, looking at the impacts of a hydrogen grid, and then what changes when we relax this energy autarky constraint and look at the import of hydrogen and various derivative fuels. So it's complicated, but I'll try and walk you through some of the results. So we have a full year of hourly data inside the model. This is just a time series for the full year, so you can see that we actually do have time series in the model, not just typical days. And you can see here the daily average power feed-in and power demand in the model. So you see a lot of variable renewables, wind in blue and solar in yellow here, with more solar in the summer, of course, and more wind in the winter. And that wind is very nicely matching the seasonality of the demand. So because of this electrification of the space heating sector, we tend to have much higher demand in the winter sectors. That's what you see in green. We have the regular electricity demand, and then we have some hydrogen production there in purple, which is then going both to direct hydrogen consumption and the various derivative fuels. So that's the time dimension, which is very important to capturing the seasonality and variability of demand and also supply. And then we can look what the model does in various scenarios in terms of the spatial distribution of its choices. So here's a scenario where we allow a certain amount of grid expansion. So we set the model that it can build a grid that's roughly 50% bigger than the power network that we have today. And the model can choose exactly where to build that grid. You see what it's doing is building a mixture of grid around the North Sea, HVDC here in purple and HVAC in gray. And what it's doing is really building the network out around the North Sea to integrate wind. So wind here is in blue, offshore in the slightly lighter blue, and it's basically bringing all of that wind from around the North Sea to the various demand centers inland in Europe. So you see a lot of grid expansion bringing it towards southern Germany, for example. We see also a band of solar in yellow around the bottom and some amount of power to heat, power to gas, and power to liquids, absorbing that wind and making fuels from it. So that's the electricity side of things. We see quite a lot of grid expansion when we allow the model to do grid expansion. And if we look on the hydrogen side, even when we have a lot of power grid expansion, it's still very attractive to build a hydrogen network. So the way this hydrogen network is structured is it brings hydrogen from where we are doing electrolysis, for example, around the North Sea, where we have lots of wind, but also in southern Europe, where we have lots of solar resources, and that's bringing that around Europe to the various demand centers in Europe. And we can now change the boundary conditions for the model to see how these two grids are affected. And in particular, what we'll do is we'll take the grid expansion and we'll restrict it. So if we restrict it in one step where we allow only 25% more grid, that's this scenario on the left, so we kind of restrict the amount of grid, then the model doesn't build as much networks, and we see a shifting from offshore wind towards onshore wind and solar energy. And what you see on the right-hand side is that we have a larger expansion now of the hydrogen grid, which is compensating for the fact that we don't have as much electricity grid to transport energy around the model. We see more of the hydrogen grid being built to compensate for that energy transport. And if we go right down to the most extreme case, where we completely restrict the electricity grid expansion, so we only have today's electricity grid, then we see a much wider mix of technologies, a lot more onshore wind, a lot more solar, and a rather substantial hydrogen network now built on the right-hand side, where we actually have hydrogen network penetrating all the way through the continent. So if we just flick back to, so you can see that the difference is if we start with a lot of power grid, we have less hydrogen network, and the more we restrict the power grid on the left-hand side, forcing more decentralized generation on the left, then the more we have an extensive hydrogen network on the right. So it's one of the preconditions for an extensive hydrogen network is that we restrict the grid expansion on the other hand. And we can map out what the effect is on the total system costs. That's what we're doing in the graphic on the left. We've taken all of the system costs on an annualized basis. So it's the annualized system costs, including investments and operational costs. And then we're varying the amount of power grid expansion on the x-axis. So you can see on the x-axis, we go from a line volume limit of 1, which means that we have the existing grid, all the way up to 2, which is a doubling of the actual grid capacity, where the model can choose to build more grid, and then we can see what effect it has on the total system investments. And what we see is that the total system costs go down the more grid we build. And what we see, the reason why it's coming down is because we're able to use better wind and solar resources at good sites, and we need less of this hydrogen infrastructure to provide backup and move energy around the system. So these systems without grid expansion here towards the left-hand side of the diagram are more expensive. But one feature of this, which is a general feature of these kind of models, is that most of this cost reduction from building the grid happens right at the beginning. So when we build our first bits of the grid, then most of the cost reduction happens for up to 25% grid expansion. After that, then the cost reduction becomes much lower. So it's very non-linear. Most of the benefit is right at the beginning, and then there's less benefit later on. So half the benefit is available at 25% of the grid expansion. And what we see is the true optimum is very far away with a sort of unrealistic amount of grid expansion. And around that optimum, it's very, very flat, the space. So you really have to go to a very limited grid expansion before the costs start going up. And just for comparison here, in the absolute numbers, we're seeing a benefit of the extra grid of around 50 billion euros per year, which is similar to studies that that ENSO-E has done in the past on these future grids. We can also look at what happens if we remove the hydrogen grid as well. So I showed you some examples where we remove the power grid expansion. That's going from top to bottom here. In the top two scenarios, we have with power grid expansion. In the bottom scenarios, without power grid expansion. And then from left to right, we have with the hydrogen grid and without the hydrogen grid. And what we see is this relatively substantial increase in costs if we actually remove the hydrogen grid. So that's going from left to right. We see cost increase for the total system of between 4 and 6%. So under these conditions, the hydrogen grid does seem to be largely beneficial, both when we have power grid expansion, but particularly when we don't have power grid expansion. So the benefit of the hydrogen grid is strongest when we don't have the power grid expansion. But the actual cost benefit of the power grid expansion is higher than the cost benefit of the hydrogen grid. So really, if you have a choice between power grid and hydrogen grid expansion, the power grid is better because it gives you a lot more flexibility. What's the model doing when we don't have the hydrogen grid? Well, it's looking at various options of electrification, but also of using derivative fuels to get around the fact that we can't move the hydrogen. It's making methane, for example, from the hydrogen, and then where necessary, using methane reforming at the demand end to turn it back into hydrogen. That's how the model is getting around it. There's a lot of conversion steps, which of course makes it more expensive. If we look at the actual amount of grid that's built, so what we're plotting here is the terawatt kilometers, the capacity times the total length, then we see that when we don't have the hydrogen network, the amount of electricity grid that's built is higher. That's what we saw already. So that's the green here, we have our electricity grid, and then in purple, we have our hydrogen network. And when we don't have grid expansion, which is the right-hand scenario here, then we have a larger amount of hydrogen network, and it's typically repurposing the amount of the hydrogen grid. About 2/3 is repurposed, and the rest is actually new hydrogen network. So one thing that really changes the results, and we're still working on this, and it's very hard to actually categorize the big space of solutions, is what happens if we have large amounts of imports from outside of Europe. Those could be electricity, green hydrogen, or the derivative e-fuels, Fischer-Tropsch fuels, ammonia, methanol. And of course, it has a very strong effect on the results. When you go from energy autarky to imports, then you need much less of the infrastructure inside Europe. You also see more of the infrastructure being pushed to the extremities, so that we are using that infrastructure to import from North Africa, maybe also from the Ukraine and Turkey. And a lot of this power to X is then outsourced. And that really removes the pressure both on land within Europe and on the network within Europe. And again, we can do this sort of sweeping analysis where we look at the import volume that we allow for those various imports on the x-axis here, and we can sweep what the effect is in the total system cost. And we find a sort of optimum volume of imports around 4,000 terawatt hours, but it's very, very flat again. So what you're seeing here in the darker colors are those expenses that are inside Europe, and then the lighter shades of those that are imported. And there's a sort of balance here, and an optimum around 4,000, but as we move away, it tends to be fairly flat, and then it rises the closer we get to the extremities. So again, there's a lot of choices that we can make here about how much we import without really affecting the costs. This is a general phenomena in these models, that there's a large degeneracy of near optimal solutions, where we have solutions that have costs very similar to the optimum, but actually very different properties. And characterizing this near optimality is something that we've done in the paper, and is really interesting to look at when we think about trade-offs. So I'm actually at the end. I wanted to do a little advert for openness and transparency, because I did this at the talk. Leonardo saw me when he initially invited me. I think this is very important that we have open models. Our systems are very complex. They're very much driven by inputs and assumptions, as I hope I've shown you. There are a lot of uncertainties, actually more than we thought there were maybe a year ago. And there are many trade-offs that we need to make between cost, acceptance, land use, industry relocation, e-fuel imports, as well as many interests. We have the gas industry pushing the hydrogen grid. We have energy-intensive industry with its own agenda, and NGOs and so on. So openness is very important, where we actually open up the data and the models that we're using to create transparency and reproducibility of these results. There's a lot of benefits, both in terms of higher credibility, avoiding duplicated effort, giving a high level of customizability, allowing new actors to participate in discussions, and enabling easier collaboration. I think it can also increase the public acceptance of these difficult trade-offs if we make more transparent to the public the reasons why we're building this infrastructure. So we have examples of people using our models. For example, the TSO Transnet BW is using the model for its own 2050 analysis, probably with different assumptions than we do. APG, the Austrian power grid, the TSO, is also using the model as well. And we've actually made the model available online at this URL. I'll share the link later, where you can actually go in and change the assumptions and see for yourself what the effect might be. So just to wrap up, I hope I've convinced you that it's not just about one or two scenarios that we need to pick out based on our own assumptions. There's really many, many trade-offs to be made. And I think it's our job as academics to really show what those trade-offs are between cost, these various infrastructure choices, speed of implementation, and security. The benefit is that we have this near optimality where we have lots of solutions that are close to optimal, but may have very other favorable probabilities. So there's actually quite a lot to choose from before we get to very expensive solutions. And we need to work out which infrastructure choices are really robust to all of these uncertainties that we have in the system. And that means calculating a lot more scenarios than we see currently used in infrastructure planning. Specifically on the hydrogen network, it definitely seems to be very robust, especially if we have limits on how much we can import from outside Europe, and the power grid is also being built as slowly as it currently is, given all the acceptance problems. But we can, of course, avoid it as well at an extra cost. There are many difficult trade-offs coming. E-fuel material imports, industry relocation is a very difficult discussion. Nobody likes it, but we should talk about it as well. We need to talk about geopolitical risk spreading with our imports. Carbon transport use and sequestration is not really being discussed enough, I think, at European and national level. And of course, openness can really help here to stimulate the discussion and allow more people to participate in it as well. So thanks for your attention, and sorry if I ran a bit over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Lucila kindly allowed me to moderate the next part of the session. And indeed, I discovered Tom in a way when he gave a really nice presentation at an event organized by our colleagues of Copenhagen. That's why we also have Christine here as one of the discussants. And I'll just let them start a discussion. I am observing the chat box. I observe that there is lots of engineers in the room that want to know, Tom, about the exact assumptions you took and need clarifications on technology choices, and and I'm sure that will come up in our discussion. But I'm really fascinated about two things, and I have to say it before we start discussing. One is that you brought open source to reality. Really, I think it's not only you are one of these people pushing that community, but I've often said it, but I've never done it. So I can only applaud people like you bringing open source to this level of professionality. Congrats for that. And also, when I hear you speak of this near optimal solution space, I'm really, really interested, because we don't always talk about that often in policy and regulatory discussions, right? Because we don't go as far as you did in exploring that space. So I very much applaud that you are doing that. Okay. Enough with the compliments. Let's start the discussion. Christine, I already mentioned you, so maybe you should start.
Okay, thank you. I'll save the bit, or shorten the bit, where I also compliment Tom on his work. I think it's very interesting, but it has been said at this point. And having said that, giving any researcher so much information, I think just makes them want more, and thus the questions aren't to criticize the scope of this study, which is amazingly broad already. But then once you have all this thrown at you, it raises a lot of questions. What else could you actually draw from it? And that's the line that I want to take, at least with the first, maybe one or two questions. And that would be on a topic that also, in the context of our work on the TYNEP, is really interesting. What about the flexibility in this model? Because you mentioned that for the generation part, as well as for the demand part in this modeling exercise, there's lots of options to shift between different technologies, but also for the technologies to adapt to the needs of the overall system, to be optimized in that sense. However, in reality, given frameworks and constraints by the operators of these technologies, it could be that not all of this manifests. So can you say anything? I mean, you're exploring these near optimal solutions. Where would we land if there is less or more flexibility in how you can optimize certain types of technologies?
Yes, that's a really good question. So the model has a lot of freedoms. The model has these localized bidding zones so that it can really use flexibility from batteries and demand side management to deload transmission lines, for example. But the most important things for cost reduction are not necessarily these batteries or demand side management, because what really drives the costs in the system is actually the seasonality of the wind and solar and the demand. What really drives the cost is actually these cold, low wind and solar periods in the winter. So those are periods where we have low coefficient of performance in the heat pumps, not very much wind and solar. And the flexibility to meet those is largely met by very centralized flexibility options. So for example, using electrolysis-based fuels to cover those peaks, or using large-scale thermal energy storage and district heating networks. So the most important flexibility options that help to really lower the costs are actually those weekly to monthly flexibility options that can be centralized, be managed centralized in a centralized way, so less susceptible to regulatory restrictions that are rather looking on the demand side and how the demand side might then interact with the system. So I think because it's the difficult parts of enabling demand side flexibility in people's houses, for example, has less of an effect on the system costs than these other more centralized flexibility options that really are responsible for keeping the costs down. So yeah, I think it is an issue, but the biggest cost reductions come from flexibility options that can be centrally managed, so are less susceptible to issues there, I would say.
Thank you, Tom. We'll come back to you, Christine, right? But let's go to Tim. But maybe one clarification question related to Christine's question on demand side is, have you taken into account distribution grids, Tom?
Yes, the distribution grids are modeled as a sort of cost that goes from, we have a low voltage level in the model and a high voltage level. And there's a distribution grid representation between that, which has capacity and cost for expansion. This is quite similar to how it's typically done in these sort of aggregated models. So it is there. There are costs for distribution grid expansion, but we're not modeling voltage limits or more complicated representative distribution grids. So it's aggregated, but it's there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll just sneak in once in a while one of these clarification questions.
But it's very relevant because on the flexibility side, the distribution grid costs do force a certain amount of decentralization, where the electric vehicles do follow what's going on in the rooftop solar side, and what the managing the combination of heat pump demand and electric vehicle is managed given the distribution grid restrictions. So they do have an effect on the results.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Tim.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. I have 3 questions. I don't know, Leo, if I go all 3 or I pick one, or
go one by one. Then we can go back to Christine and come back to you.
Don't want to go too hard. But I have a question on the results on the role of offshore wind. I see that, relatively speaking, onshore, at least in terms of cost, if I get it right, seems to take the really bigger share of the pie. And if I also read your paper yesterday, and you say we get a lot more renewables installed than the European Commission scenarios. And in these European Commission scenarios, I think the role of offshore wind would be a lot more important than in your model, relatively speaking. And I wonder why that is. And it goes back to the discussion that one of the points, or the key points that you make, is that it's very hard to build new electricity networks, right? But maybe it is easier, or maybe it is difficult, but for other reasons, to build them offshore than onshore. And I don't think that you make that distinction. I think both might be difficult, but onshore might be because of NIMBY and other stuff. Offshore might be because we need multilateral cooperation. So, and if you think about renewables, it might be harder to have them onshore because of, again, the same NIMBY issues, especially wind. But to build them offshore might have less, let's say, objections. So that kind of distinction of onshore, offshore acceptability, cables and resources, I don't know what you think about that and how that is reflected in your results or not.
So I think on the grid expansion side, it would be useful to separate this grid restriction between the onshore and the offshore. So I think on the grid side, I think that's totally valid because we restrict them both at the same time. But the acceptance problem, as you say, is really with the onshore side. So I agree in the results it would be better to separate that and allow a bigger expansion on the offshore side than the onshore side, because that would allow some of this balancing of the grid. But you still have the same problems of bringing the power inland from the offshore side. In terms of this relation of onshore versus offshore, so what we also do in the paper is we actually restrict the onshore, which tends to be cost optimal because of the lower cost. And what we're doing here on the x-axis is the similar sort of sweep where we restrict the amount of onshore wind potential, and it does in fact get substituted by offshore wind and more solar, but then you need a lot more infrastructure to bring that power again from the coastlines inland. So it tends to emphasize again the hydrogen side of things more strongly when you restrict the amount of onshore wind and onshore grid as well. So we can push the model more. If we think the onshore is restricted, we can push it also more into the offshore direction, but it will come at this increased cost because it has a higher integration cost than the onshore, which can be built closer to the demand centers.
Maybe one little follow-up. Some TSOs or other entities are talking on then, instead of building offshore electricity cables to make electrolysis offshore and then bring it via pipes. Is that something that you see in your model, or is that out of the game?
It's something we're building this capability into the model, but it doesn't do it right now. So these offshore sites are actually point connected from the offshore parks onto the nearest point in land. And it's only with electricity. And then at the coastline, then you can convert it into hydrogen. But we're putting into the model the capability to also consider meshed offshore grids and hydrogen production on these offshore nodes, be they energy islands or rigs. So it's not there in the model at the moment, but it probably would help the model to balance the offshore grid. What we also haven't got in the model is floating offshore, which can also open up another set of possibilities if the onshore is restricted, and that's something that we're looking at the moment. But there's definitely scope there to explore more avenues for offshore wind. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't have a clarification question related to this offshore, so we'll go directly to Christine. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So maybe to pick one other thing that I would be interested in, these different options that you're analyzing, where sometimes some part of the grid expansion is sort of circumvented by some other type of technology that's being implied. It doesn't change much in the overall system cost, therefore it's like near optimal potentially, but it will certainly shift who benefits. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but do you have any insights, or did you look into that as to how some solutions might change the supply cost in, say, the natural gas sector, which at some point might rise quite high, and how cheap or expensive would hydrogen be given some of the constraints you're exploring, and maybe also for electricity or some other factors? Do you look at that at all? Because if we're choosing between and trading off, then those could be quite interesting dimensions.
Yes, God, it's a difficult one to answer because it's a big one. I mean, you know, we have looked at welfare redistribution and cost redistribution, and of course, the more we restrict the grids, then the more unequal it becomes, both in the cost distribution. We see higher costs in those areas with less good resources, as you'd expect. And if we do restrict the hydrogen network, then we will see like higher costs for if for locally produced ammonia, for example, or electricity in those regions which are less well connected. So it does have these distributional effects when we restrict transport. And it's kind of what you expect. The more trade you have, the more equalization of the prices you have, and then overall welfare benefit. But you do get, of course, individual parts of the network which are disproportionately disadvantaged. And we see this always in the grid discussion. You know, in Germany, we've had this discussion going on for so long about splitting up the grid into different nodes and how that's going to disproportionately affect consumers in the south of Germany. And you will also see that then in the model, especially once you start taking away options, taking away hydrogen network, for example, you will see then in the inland regions, costs for both electricity and various gases and derivative gases go higher. So yeah, there definitely will be those effects there. I don't think we put them in the paper. I think we had some geographical price information with the different scenarios, if I remember right. But yeah, this effect is there, and it's definitely something to bear in mind. Yeah.
Right.
I can't give you anything quantitative right now.
Yeah, no, I'm not asking about quantitative, of course, but you focus mostly on geographical, but what about between sectors? Just since Tim got a follow-up, I can also be more specific.
I mean, generally what happens in these models is that the electricity prices are higher than they would be historically, and with transport costs tend to be lower. We see more costs in the heating sector, and especially in the industry sector, things start to get much more expensive. So although the system costs stay similar, we see big transfers between the different sectors, and in particular the industry sector, as we decarbonize, has to face much higher costs. So there is definitely this redistribution between the sectors, and it's why industry decarbonization is a particular challenge. But it's also in the space heating. Space heating is another one that comes under a lot of pressure as we decarbonize, because of this need to get energy in or heat into the households in these very cold periods is difficult to do. Especially when you don't have district heating networks where you can then do sort of juggling between the different technologies.
Okay, great. And I like the new standard. One question plus a follow-up question. So related to what you just said, heat buildings, there was one question from the audience. You know, when you see hydrogen being used, where in your modeling, right? What kind of end uses do you see? And that Vikram would like to know, do you also see heating for buildings?
So we did a few tests of hydrogen heating in buildings, and it was never selected by the model. So we actually just excluded it from the start in these model runs. But from previous modeling experience, it just doesn't get built. We do see in some sectors, yeah, there is some amount of backup boiler, so hybrid heat pump built, including the existing methane boilers built as backup for heat pumps in buildings which are not very well insulated. So that does appear in the model, but hydrogen boilers themselves would need all the infrastructure, the distribution grid structure, and so on. And there's a lot of inefficiencies, of course, in the conversions that doesn't really come up in the model. The hydrogen is primarily used in the industry sector for derivative fuels, for aviation, shipping, and the chemicals industry, ammonia, and we can choose to have it for heavy trucking, for example, and to some extent in the power and district heating sector for those as a backup for those cold, dark periods in the winter. But no, it doesn't really come up in the building sector. Yeah.
And then when you restrict the power grid expansion, you still see the same end uses, but just more of it, or how?
You see, particularly for the backup for power and district heating, more usage of the hydrogen in that sector. So the model will use much more hydrogen than in southern Germany for backup power, because there's no other option. It's something that springs in when there's no other good option from wind and solar in the wintertime. So you'll see a lot of hydrogen power stations then in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg as an example.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
But that relies on the hydrogen grid, and I think it's one of the worries that I have is that you require this triangle of supply, demand, and transport infrastructure to make that work in southern Germany. And that all has to be there for that to make sense. And I think that's definitely a big risk that we're taking by relying on hydrogen there as a solution.
Okay, very interesting. Tim?
Yes.
And please don't change the standard again by going for 2 follow-up questions.
No. Maybe the question I have is in the energy autarky scenario, I wonder what is because if you think about hydrogen, people want to hear one number, right? Like, what is the price in euro or dollar per kilo? Like, what kind of number do you get, and how does that relate to potential numbers for import? And how does that relate to potential fuel switching between hydrogen or electricity? Because if that is very high, and I think that some of the fuel switching is somehow exogenous and some is endogenous, if I get it right. Like, did you do the kind of back testing of whether those numbers are in line with scenarios and so on? I assume yes.
Yeah, so we coupled this with another study where we looked at the imports from outside of Germany, which we then used for costing the imports. And it sort of depends a bit where you're going from. So it's a bit hard to read, but there are different options here for bringing the energy into Europe. And this is in various years, 2030 up to 2050. And this is cost per energy delivered. And generally, when you look at this, the lowest cost options do tend to be hydrogen via pipeline from Spain or with excess PV, or from Denmark with its bountiful onshore and offshore wind. And we tend to be getting costs there that are around maybe 80 to 90 euros per megawatt hour for the hydrogen pipeline imports, and then even lower in 2050. So we can calibrate the prices inside the model then against this very simple study where we looked at the worldwide import. But I think the import question is better focused on what we actually need. We need ammonia, we need direct reduced iron, we need chemicals for the industry, and we need Fischer-Tropsch products for our aviation and shipping. Then it makes more sense to focus the discussion on there. What's the cost of doing that in Europe versus importing it, rather than hydrogen specifically? Because hydrogen is just an intermediary to what we actually want, which is power and heat and fuels for dense fuels for aviation and shipping, and direct reduced iron. So it maybe focuses a bit to go into those secondary products rather than the hydrogen itself.
And I get my one follow-up, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because you said in this, the Dunkelflaute, or what people, there is no other option than to rely on hydrogen. I mean, I always see four other options, and I think you cover 2. One other option is to have massive networks. That's the one you cover, and you see that there's limitations to it. The second option is to massively overbuild renewables. This is also something that you cover. But then there are 2 other. One is long duration storage, electrochemical, which I think in the US at least they're talking about, but I don't know how that will evolve. And the other one is nuclear, which is not considered in the model, which is also very controversial. And I saw SMR in your technologies, and I thought, damn, you're considering small modular reactors, but it's actually steam methane reforming. So I was a bit confused. So I wonder what you think of these 2 other options, which would compete with hydrogen. I don't know, depending on their cost characteristics, but who knows?
Yes, I mean, I would also add there's other technologies as well. There's this advanced geothermal technologies, the advanced and enhanced geothermal technologies. There's biomass, which we do have in the model, but does actually get used for these Dunkelflauten in CHP networks as well, and is also used in industry for some parts of the process heat. The long duration energy storage, we've done trials with the long duration energy storage in there, and it really depends on the cost level. I think Form Energy was talking $10 to $20 per kilowatt hour for the capital cost of their solution, and it tends to get squeezed between the lithium-ion batteries in the model and the hydrogen in the model, because the hydrogen is basically a form of long-duration energy storage, which has very, very low capital cost, at least for those regions where you can do underground caverns because you have the salt deposits. But where it does become interesting in long-duration energy storage is those areas where you don't have the geological conditions for hydrogen storage, and you maybe don't have the hydrogen network to link you to those areas. Then the long-duration energy storage could make sense. But again, it really requires very, very low cost to be able to bridge these multi-week periods where you have low wind and solar. So it really has to be down to the $5 to $10 per kilowatt hour range. And I don't really see these companies even targeting down into that range. I think there you really want something chemically based, something hydrogen derived to get to benefit from the low costs. Otherwise, you're not going to get there with the electrochemical options that they're talking about at the moment in long duration energy storage. Nuclear power, we have done various papers where we do include it. And again, it's a question of the cost. It definitely becomes interesting once you get down to 4,000 to 5,000 euros per kilowatt specific installation costs. There it definitely does get built by the model, but it doesn't overtake the model. You really have to go down to 2,000 to 3,000 euros per kilowatt to really see a lot of nuclear being built in the model. So it can be helpful at a particular cost point, but it very much depends on the cost point. It's not a silver bullet, and the cost levels you need to really see a wide building of nuclear in the model are basically utopic given the current costs of building in the West. Maybe some of these reactors that are being exported by China and South Korea apparently can get down to those numbers, but we haven't seen them in actual implemented projects in Western Europe or North America in the last 20 years.
Great. The follow-up question was bigger than the first one, Tim. You're still changing style slightly. Christine, up to you to see how you can innovate the format further.
No, I will not continue this trend. But maybe as a comment to what you said, the way I understand it, you might as well include nuclear and it would just not show up, and then this kind of question wouldn't arise, right? But that's not my question. My question is going to be about the gas grids and how the hydrogen is also a gas, the gas grid, the new gas grids, how they evolve. And I'm particularly interested, part of that will be repurposed natural gas grids. Can you say something about how much of that and with what path? Like, does that start now already, or do we wait a bit to repurpose things? What have you found about that?
So these scenarios I was showing you are overnight scenarios where we didn't look at the pathway. When we've looked at the pathway, it's been in lower spatial resolution, so I can't really give you a good answer to that question. But we did split the hydrogen network into retrofitting of the natural gas grid. That's the darker purple here, and new hydrogen network. And we see of the hydrogen grid that actually ends up getting used, maybe 2/3 of it can be retrofitted because we have hydrogen demand for transport following where the natural gas is today, and some amount being built new for new connections. So there is a majority being retrofitted, which I think more or less agrees with the hydrogen backbone studies from the gas industry, that we can get a high proportion of this grid built by retrofitting pipelines. But it's also something that's very discrete. So if you look in the Netherlands, where they're already doing this, they have several corridors where you have 3 or 4 parallel pipelines, and you maybe convert one of them, and then you see how it goes. And then as the natural gas demand reduces and maybe the hydrogen demand increases, you convert the second one. So it'll be a very discrete process that maybe begins with pipelines that are currently underused, like the Eugal pipeline that was built to bring Nord Stream 2's gas from the northeast coast of Germany down into central Germany, and Czechoslovakia is not going to be needed, right? So that would be a good place to start in Germany. So probably you'll see very specific projects that start, and then this discrete conversion process over the next 20 years, if indeed the hydrogen network proves to be something that's really actually built and useful. And I hope I put at least a bit of uncertainty on that question in the talk as well.
Thank you. Let me just put one question to you from the audience, from Jaap. So he would like to know, so he saw that you did your demand calculated bottom up, right, for various sectors. And he would like to know how that relates to the 10YNDP hydrogen demand scenarios. I don't know if you checked that, huh? But I have no idea how they created that demand. Yeah, maybe Christine knows.
I would have to go back and look again. I mean, where we see big differences with the classical scenarios is that we really have all the feedstocks in the model. So not just the ammonia, but also the feedstocks, the chemical industry, which we force to come from low carbon sources. And that tends to be the difference that causes us to have higher hydrogen demand than some of the other scenarios. I would have to go and double check that though.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So I've seen a couple of scenarios where they actually have oil imports and then sequestration of the plastics afterwards, which is basically a form of carbon sequestration, which we like to keep control of in the model and not just allow.
Okay. Tim, go ahead. We still have some minutes.
Yes, about the near optimal solutions. If you have to pick maybe one thing that you did not consider, and I don't blame you because it adds another complexity, is somehow resilience to shocks. So you can expect climate shocks. If you depend on hydrogen from, let's say, North Africa, and it's a little bit cheaper, maybe you don't do it because there might be geopolitical shocks. What do you think is most robust in the sense, is this hydrogen network adding to the robustness of the system against shocks if you keep it internal, or is power networks something? Because basically I expect this to happen. I mean, you're looking at the next decades to come. These things will happen. So what is your thinking about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And I sort of pointed a bit towards it here, that we need to think about this risk spreading and robust scenarios and really calculate a lot of scenarios and make sure the infrastructure choices we make are robust to as many as possible. What is robust from my experience is obviously a lot of wind and solar. That tends to be useful in almost every scenario if it's built within Europe, because then you're not relying on geopolitical risk from outside Europe as long as the European Union stays coherent. Transmission grid expansion always tends to help the system balance out the variability of the renewables and integrate the markets, and also for security of supply is very important. So building more transmission grid, more local renewables inside Europe is going to be robust across many of these different scenarios. And when we think about the e-fuel imports, we obviously have to think very carefully about what kind of fractions we want to have from each country and spread that risk around. And shipping liquid fuels is obviously more robust than gas pipelines. So whether it's LNG or liquefied hydrogen or ammonia or methanol, that's all going to be much more robust infrastructure if it can be shipped than building a hydrogen pipeline down into North Africa, which has a single point of failure. So I think we will have to do basically stochastic optimization, where we run through all the possible things that can happen and make sure that the scenarios are robust to those different options. It's not something we've done here. We've looked at single scenarios. We haven't looked at that robustness, but I can say just from gut feeling what that would look like, and it would be more local renewables, more grid, and diversified e-fuel imports, preferably by ship, because that's less invincible to attack or single geopolitical points of failure.
Great. Christine, you have the last word if you want. If not, I will try to say something sensible in the last minute.
I can maybe have like a small question that can fit nicely into the last minute. And that would be, your model is quite powerful and it can have really high resolution and so on. And you've already mentioned how some other efforts do this with smaller models like the TYNP in this market zone approach and so on. Which of these results would we not see if we simplified too much? Like what is the stuff that we really need to pay attention to?
So if you really simplify it, then you're not going to see the difficulties in getting energy to southern Germany, for example, or inland. Because if you have a single copper plate for Germany, it just looks like you can just build lots of offshore wind and everything's going to be fine. But we see today there are grid bottlenecks inside Germany, which are causing a large amount of redispatch demand. And if you just keep on piling in wind and solar in the north of Germany, then you're just going to get ever higher redispatch, and that will also have climate implications. So if you don't do it, if you don't model these things, then you're going to end up with a system that just is not feasible and doesn't function. It doesn't meet your climate targets, and it'll be very, very expensive. And it will put the flexibility in the wrong places, and the generation in the wrong places, and you'll end up in a big hot mess at the end.
Great. So to conclude, we liked it. It was great. I think you will have a few follow-up conversations, Tom, because there is lots of people that would like to compare their studies with yours and assumptions. And I think Jaap will talk to you about the demand. Ronnie mentioned another study. So I'm afraid you will have some follow-up conversations. I hope that's okay for you.
Absolutely. I'm happy to stay for another 10 minutes if anyone wants to join in further discussions. That's totally fine. So I planned a bit of extra time. So thanks a lot for all the interest and the questions. And thanks again for the invitation and for the discutants as well for keeping the conversation alive. Thanks.
And we will share, of course, all the material, right? Because Tom is all about openness. So I'm sure he will be okay to share his slides as well. He's sharing his whole model. So, or do you feel strong about PowerPoints, Tom?
No, the slides are in the chat. I've already shared them.
Okay,
and
okay.
It's using open source LaTeX, not PowerPoint. So. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, even the wrong terminology here, Lucilla.
Thank you, Leo. I think it was wonderful indeed. As I said in the beginning, this is the perfect presentation and style of work you wanted to have in FSR Insights. Critical thinking, reflection, and thank you, Tom. Thank you a lot. Congratulations.